Wow, that seemed quick. Uh, so here we go. We're going to look at two quite straightforward bond problems. The first bond problem is simple, find the value of the bond problem. And the second one is still pretty simple, solve for the yield to the owner of the bond type problem. These are both problems that are in the back of the chapter 5 in the textbook. The first is problem 510, which I think, as best I recall, is also a homework problem. And the other is problem 514, which I don't believe is a homework problem, to the best of my recollection. So let's go very quickly to the spreadsheet. These are this is in Excel spreadsheet posted on Canvas. You have these problems. I would encourage you to follow along, open up your spreadsheet and watch and fill in along as I fill in my spreadsheet, and make sure that you understand all the steps that we're going through. So I'm going to share my screen with you here, and let's see, that looks like that one there should work. So here we go. Problem 510, and the problem statement is what is the maximum price you will pay for a bond? So we're solving for V sub n. That's immediately evident. With a face value of $1,000, it tells us what Z is, and a coupon rate of 14% paid annually. So we know R is 14% and it's paid annually. That's makes things easy. If you want a yield to maturity of 10%, that's our desired interest rate. Assume that the bond will mature in 10 years from now, we assume, and the first payment will be received in 1 year. That is, the first dividend payment is 1 year from now, which would be expected. That's one period in the future, so our bond equation works, right? Our P given A, our P is one period before the first A, so that all works out well. Let's fill in here the variables as we know them. The face value is $1,000. I'm sorry, I gave it one too many zeros. Let's edit that. There we go, $1,000. R, the coupon rate or bond rate is 14%, and that's annually. C is the value we're going to get at the end of the ownership of the bond. We're not selling it early. There's nothing in this question that implies that we're selling it early. And if there is no explicit discussion of that, then we can assume that the holder of the bond will keep it to maturity. And in those cases, C, or the value we get at the end, is equal to Z, $1,000. I, remember, is the yield. That's what the purchaser, or in general, it would be the purchaser, the holder of the bond, the current holder of the bond, wishes to receive in terms of return, in this problem, a yield to maturity of 10%. N is given in years. We have 10 years to maturity. And R times Z is the periodic. For this problem, it's annual. The periodic dividend itself, the cash dividend that's paid by the issuing organization to the bondholder, and that's R times Z. So R times Z, $140. Okay. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, wait a minute. If the Coupon rate is 14%. Why would you want 10%? Well, the purchaser of the bond, that may be the best they can do. The market, if you today were the owner of a bond that paid 14% and you wanted to sell it, for example, you would sell it at such a price because it's so attractive that someone would pay you enough money that they would ultimately only earn 10%. And we'll see that here as we look at the answer that we find. And I'll say right now that I can tell you something about that answer, and I can tell you that that answer will be greater than $1,000. That is, the purchaser will pay more than the face value of the bond in order to get that bond, because that is a sweet 14% is a really nice payment, dividend payment. And if so, 10% return is still a lovely return. So I'll pay more than $1,000 for that bond. Let's see what that answer is. The good news is that we only need to put in the present value function. One present value function does it all. Let's look. Equal PV. Notice I'm not going to put a negative sign in front of the PV. And I'm not, because the signs on my cash flows are right. And this really is like a loan. Just exactly the purpose that Excel uses for the function, the PV function. So my answer will come out to be a negative number, which is a negative cash flow, which is exactly what V sub n would be for the purchaser of a bond. So we're equal to PV of, what's the rate? Well, remember, the rate is the yield. This is the I. So this is the yield for the bond purchaser. That's 10%. Number of periods is the number of periods of ownership, and we're assuming that the purchaser will keep it to maturity, 10 years. PMT, for bond problems, that's the dividend, the actual cash dividend that the bondholder receives over the life of ownership of the bond. That's R times Z, adjusted for whatever period of cash flows. For this problem, it's annual, so it's $140. And the next argument, the final argument for us, is FV, the future value, which is what we receive from the bond at the end. That is our C or Z. They're the same value for this problem. We're keeping it to maturity, so the C, the cash we get at the end, is equal to the face value. And there it is. $1,246 is the cash that the purchaser would pay for this $1,000 bond. And that's it. That's the problem. That's all there is to it. Very straightforward, I hope. You can see that in the next two examples we work, one more in this video and one in the next. We'll see as things get a little bit more complicated how some of the how the equation can change just a little bit. The function parameters change a little bit. So let's go ahead and jump into problem 514. Here we go. We'll look at this one. It's another annual dividend problem. Here's a description of the bond. A U.S. government bond matures in 10 years. And I'll go ahead and put it in here. It's an annual dividend. So I'm just going to go ahead and put in the 10 years down here for N. Its quoted price now is 96.4, which means the buyer will pay $96.40 per $100 of the bond's face value. We saw this when I discussed bonds in class briefly, and we looked at the bond prices, some of the data on bonds from the Wall Street Journal. This tells us that the buyer is paying less than face value for the bond, and is paying $96.40 for every $100 face value. And we're not going to do anything with that yet, but we will in a moment. The bond pays 5% interest on its face value each year. 5% is the coupon rate or the bond rate. I'm going to place that here, 5%. If $10,000 face value worth of these bonds are purchased now, so the face value of the bonds we're purchasing now is $10,000. What is the yield to the investor who holds the bonds for 10 years? So we know that the investor is paying, right here, is paying $96.40 per $100 of the bond's face value. So the price, we're going to put in here, the price is the value of the bond that the current bondholder would have paid for the bonds. So that's equal $96.40. It's per 100. And so we'll take that times 100 because there are $100 worth of bonds in $10,000, right? Or if you prefer to do it this way, it's 96.4 cents per dollar. So we could take 0.964 times $10,000. However you wish to figure it, that's the price of the bond. However, let's make note, we need to make that a negative value because it's a cash outflow. The purchase of the bond is a cash outflow. And if we want our function to be easy to use, we'll keep our signs correct in our data for the problem. R times Z, let's fill that out, is R times Z, $500. It's annual. And the last phrase here was the yield to the investor who holds bonds for 10 years. Matures in 10 years, holds for 10 years. So C, the redemption value, is equal to Z. Let me see, if we think about our cash flow diagram for the bond, there we have it. V, the purchaser purchases it for $9,640. Then the purchaser receives $500 each and every year for the next 10 years, and then sells sells the bond back to the company. The company calls the bond at maturity date, and the bond purchaser then receives $10,000 in cash for the value of the bond. And the question asked is, what is the yield to the investor? What's the rate of return? Like the previous problem, problem 10, this is a one function answer to this, and it's the rate function. Remember, we did the rate function in class. The rate function, the number of periods is 10. PMT is represented by the dividends, the annual dividends received. The present value is the purchase value of the bond. And the future value is the value we get at the end. In this case, it's Z, the face value of the bond, because the bondholder kept it to maturity. That's it. Again, if the signs are proper and are correct, we'll get the correct rate. The good news is with the gas, we talked about multiple rates of return in class. You'll notice that we only have one sign change when we look at the series of cash flows. So we don't have to worry about a guess. There is only one rate for a bond problem. And that's it. So here we go, 5.48%. So the purchaser of this bond, it's a 5% bond, but because the purchaser pays less than face value, the yield to the purchaser or investor is greater than the bond rate. It's a little bit greater than the bond rate, and that difference is all because the price paid was less than the face value of the bond. So that's the two problems we were going to look at in this video. It is always going to be the case that if the purchaser purchases the bond for less than the face value, then the yield will be greater than the bond rate. If the purchaser pays more than the face value, then the yield will be less than the bond rate. That's always going to be a kind of one of those gut check things to make sure your answers are proper. In the next video, we will look at a single problem of a purchaser of a bond who then sells the bond. And that gets a little more complicated and requires a little bit more thought. I know you don't want to look too hard at these videos, but at least the part of the video you should spend more time in perhaps is Excel and not me. That's the good news. So one more video in this series of bond videos, and you'll find that the answers still are pretty straightforward, but the concept and the understanding of exactly what's going on with the bond might be a little bit confusing. So we'll have that. I'll complete that other video soon, and I will post it up when it's ready. Thank you very much.